Hey, welcome back. You have arrived at the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is a series of lessons for you to win your fantasy football drafts, and that's about 60% ish of the game. So you'll be well on your way to crushing your leagues. This is the 20th lecture or lesson, and I hope you start at the beginning, but if you jump around, you've arrived at the quarterback positional analysis, and I think this is actually part one. I will have too many slides to do it all in a block of time, so we're going to start here. This is looking still above the names and looking more at the position. We are defining our metrics that we use for our reference class forecasting, and that just puts us on the average and a foundation for us to start applying our approach to the upcoming season. And that's just how I recommend, and that is part of my process, the process. And let's continue here. Let's move. And positional analysis from 02 to 20, certainly 18 years looking at the quarterback, and we're following the end of season EOS rankings from top 1 to 12. So we're talking the actual real data, not ADP, which is a guess, the crowd's guess as to how it goes. This is the actual real data, and there's a big difference, but sometimes between ADP and the end of season. So I'm looking at what actually happened, not what the public thought could happen in each of these years. I like a broad view just to kind of get a handle on changes, kind of these mega trends. And you've got to be that way. You cannot just myopically focus on my dog's guarding my fortress here, and you can't just rely on just last year. You've got to look beyond that. This is a table here, first starting looking at the data, and and we have position, the year, 02 to 20, and then the end of season rank, 1st to 12th quarterbacks. I took the whole metrics here and colorized and marked the higher scoring in the green and the lowest in the red, so we can see, as you might predict, the lower ranked quarterbacks will be producing less points. That makes sense. But notice the skewness over the time, that the worst productions in the back half of the top 12 quarterbacks occurred, 08 and back, and those were 8th to 12th, maybe 7th to 12th. So things have definitely changed just seeing this colorization map here. I also took the top 6 and circled then with purple the top 3 within the 18-year points, and we see that 2020 was a banner year, as was 2018. And pretty much starting in 2011, we have been living in the era of the golden quarterback as far as productions here and the amount of points. So all quarterbacks are producing more points for us, which is kind of interesting. But the actual gap between, say, the 12th and the 1st is not changed or actually gone up a little bit. If you look at 2020, the top was at 462, the bottom was at 343 here. Let me get my marker. There's the bottom, and there's, of course, the top right there. So that's about, what is that, 120? And in 02, it was close to 95 or so. So, yes, we're getting more points even out as the 12th, but the actual positioning of all is a little broader than, some of the early years. So, you're still the 7th quarterback. Even though it's more points, everybody's gone up more points. So in some ways, cracking the code of the quarterback has not really been any easier. Hadn't been harder, but the thing that has changed is relative to the rest of your team, the quarterback's value, if you look at points, has gone up. And so if you're picking a later quarterback, you're going to have to make up those points somewhere else. And that's the whole point of the later quarterback, the idea that somehow, you can make that point up elsewhere if you're going for the higher running backs and wide receivers, tight ends, etc. So more points doesn't necessarily help us because the gap's a little bit different. So it may be a little riskier being in doing late quarterbacks than it's ever been if you just kind of look at the gap between the total points there. You don't hear a lot of that discussion as well. So people are kind of missing that subtle point, but that's fine. That means you don't miss it and you allow to be more thoughtful, and that gives us a little bit of an edge here or there. So if you rack up and these little fine points, they actually, in a accumulation, help your journey there. Here's my other dog going nuts. Okay, so all those little fine points together hopefully help us with an edge, and certainly in the drafting here. So this is colorization across the whole gamut here of the metrics. Another way to look at the data is I actually went column by column and did a separate colorization. And it pretty much shows that 2020 is the best that's pretty much ever been from 1st to 12th. Yeah, I know the first is like the 3rd best ever in 18 years, but it's certainly suggested that from 11 on that things have really changed for the quarterback position, and where the quarterback is worth more point wise on your fantasy team than it ever has been. And that's a key element. You're getting more points, but if the gap is not narrowing, then taking a late quarterback is still costing you points too, in which you've got to make it up somewhere down the road. And again, these are all on averages. If you're good at picking the mispriced quarterbacks, then that's so late quarterback is assuming that you can wait 6th, 7th, 8th picks and somehow get a top 3 or 4 quarterbacks. So you're basically you're buying low and then you're collecting high. The idea is that the public is not perfect with ADP. Your league makes are not perfect, and you can find a bargain. Hey, anytime you find a bargain is all good for you and your team. But on average, that's a little more risky, or I guess a little more with a little bit more uncertainty because the gaps have not shrunk. So you're still, on average, if you're picking 8th, it's still the 8th best on average. Okay, and you need to think about what that means there. But that allows us to begin to think about the deeper questions, right? we're not done with our quarterback uh, analysis for the next season. Not even close. We're just setting the table and understanding the averages, which is kind of establishing the outsider's view. Remember the insider's view, ourselves, and maybe thinking like friends, we're all seeing the same thing and we're missing some of the good stuff here because we're just biased and missing that, and we're less skillful than we think, right? And we're more subjected to biases than we think. So the only way to deal with that is you at least approach things in a different way, maybe more cautiously, to at least understand and be thoughtful. Like, oh, I know this is a sure thing. Yeah, is it a sure thing or not? Just it's good to be aware and question and do extra research to figure out these kind of things. So again, colorization across each column here gives you a view that was different than the previous view across all the data. And again, that's why I like to think about things. So now let's think in general terms, the top half and the bottom half of the 12, and in terms of fantasy point averages and percent loss, right? This is kind of related to the gap issue between the top half and the bottom half. Let's see, has that really stayed the same or gone up? So that's kind of a question we can use the data to address. And here we go, position, year, the average fantasy points, top half, the average fantasy points, bottom half of the top 12. And here's percent loss if you're on average picking late versus the early. Okay, we see that in 02, 3, and 5, the loss was 10% and some were 12%. Notice we see some as high as the top was 25% gap there. Wow. How are we doing recently? It's going to cost us about 14%. So the gap has not dropped, kind of in a collective at all. So notice the average has gone up. Great. We're all excited, but the gap has not gone up. So, you're saying, well, when you talk about? Well, if you had the same averages, but the gap was, say, 6%, so that would have been the lowest in 18 years. So what that meant was almost every quarterback you picked was almost the same as far as production than the other one. So really, that means there's very little difference, and you should, in fact, go later because you're not losing as much. But with the gap 14, 15%, you're not, gaining anything on average going late quarterback. You know, I mean, if you could go back in time to 2003, you're actually gaining more in those years at 10%. The gap was less. So you have a better shot just on average at using the late quarterback successfully. So the gaps in the last 6, 8 years, there's nothing dramatic. 2017 was interesting. And if you look at the data, the top 1 and 2 quarterbacks were almost on top to top, the 3, 4, 5, and 6 quarterback. That was a weird year for that. Notice how it sticks out on the top average there. Okay, so, but pretty much nothing in this data on averages suggests that late quarterback picking is more or less favored than it ever was. Okay, I argue it's equally as unfavorable as it's always been. It's just you're relying, and this is just on average. Okay, and you got to, and that's a hard thing to figure out when somebody says on average. it's hard to imagine that because our bias says, oh, we can beat the average. But at least you know going in what's going on, right? You should not be fooled that, oh, this is really easy. It's not. Okay, it's not. If you have records where you've done well over the past, then that maybe you have some good, a little bit higher skill level. But right now, unless you have something that's, probably some nice data points, you're just going to have to assume that you're going to have to be good elsewhere if you go late quarterback picking. Okay, so again, nothing in the gapping here between the top and the bottom averages suggests that anything is different in that there. Okay, we now look at the previous tabular data in kind of a visual way with the grafting of the data points from 02 to 20. The green is the top half average. The red circles are the bottom half average. And then the green line is the polynomial trend line. The red line is the polynomial trend line for the bottom half of the quarterback average. And the yellow dash line is the percentage loss each year there. And so I think the first thing is notice the gap between the trend line really hasn't changed so much. It was a little less here. I talked about that a little bit, but certainly, yes, notice the average has gone up, but the average of the bottom has gone up. If there was some type of different gapping, then it would be worse. In other words, if this red line was down in here, that would show a higher gap. So early quarterback would be suggested. Or if the red line had got to this point, right, and they were on top of each other, that would be skewed towards late quarterback. But what we see gap-wise has not really changed so much. This percent loss was actually the highest during 7 to maybe 10 or 11. And this is us in the 15-16, and we've gone up a little bit in the last couple of years, but nothing dramatic. So nothing has gotten better. And like I said, the best years were probably these early years here. Your lesser in the gap was a little narrower. And so the data pretty much has been steady through 18 years. So there's nothing in the data that would predict early quarterback or late quarterback is more or less favored than it's always been. So be aware that, just because you might hear people going one way or the other, they're not basing it on the data. I don't know what they're basing it on. But then again, podcast, I don't know what they're doing. There are a lot of people flapping their chops, and the louder, they flap, the more authoritarian they sound. And it's just take it for entertainment here. Listen to the poor jokes and the funny music, and, use it if you need. I don't listen to too many podcasts. I do listen to my friends Chaos and Disorder, so I'm gonna give them a plug here. But they're just kind of they're common sense, but they're funny as well. So, and I think they take themselves with the right amount of seriousness, which is very little. So it's strictly a lot of times for entertainment purposes. So I would suggest you give them a listen. I'm definitely all down for Chaos and Disorder there. Check those guys out on their podcast. Great. Okay. So let's move on then, looking at the quarterbacks. So let's talk then and move to variation. Variation uh, works to give us an idea of the size of the groups, right? From the top 1 to 12. It points to the gap, in other words, and points to the distribution in that gap. So a lot of variation means that there's a lot of differences uh, point wise in 12 quarterbacks. A low variation would be not a lot of differences. So low variation would be more supportive of late quarterbacks. High variation would support early quarterback drafting. So variation can give us some ideas and give us some directionality in our draft plans. Okay. That's what, if you don't mathematically understand the normal distribution and what standard deviation and two standard deviation elements and extreme, after that. First thing I'll say is I'm not sure fantasy sports data is normally distributed. I haven't spent a lot of time to figure that out. There's a lot of different deeper statistical tricks to deal with non-normal normalized data, but you don't hear a lot about that. Sample sizes are small, and the data is probably not normally distributed, so that makes it even tougher. So that means we take data, which is better on average than judgments. Even the data has to be taken with some trepidation, about using your draft capital. But it's good to look across landscapes like we did 18 years, and you start getting the confidence goes up if you have a lot of sample points. Your confidence should be really low if you don't have a lot of sample points. So during the season, last week's samples are not too high, right? Versus the complete season samples gets better as we go. So people claim that they get better as you go in like daily fantasy sports, and probably that is the case. So it gets a little uncertain early in the season if you play daily fantasy. So I then looked at the variation just in recent times from 2014 to 20. And let's see what we see here. So what I'm doing is looking, and these numbers, minus numbers, is a way to compare last year's ranking with this year's ranking. So what I mean by that is, can we use last year's rankings, say the top 24 in this case, as a way to predict this year's production? Okay, so I actually did that, and the data is shown here. And how you figure this out is this, and I'll try to go through it. So I actually started in 2013 and looked at the top 24 quarterbacks into the season. And of course, each position has a name, that person. Then I looked at the 2014 position of those same people and noted whether they were in the same position or whether they were in a different position. And if they were below where they were the year before, I gave them a minus number, minus positional number. And if they were above where they were, then that would have been a plus number. So in 2014, how you read this is the first position player in 2013 ended 2014 three rankings below, so fourth. The second best player in 2013 was the third best player in 2014. The third in 2013 was 15 slots below, so at the 18th pick, and so forth. So the seventh player in 13 was the second, actually the first player this year, 2014. So I colorize those numbers. Green is did better. Deeper red did much, worse, and the yellows not too dramatic here. And so we can look across and we can see that in some years your top previous year quarterback did not return any kind of value. In fact, we lost value big time. So your draft capital was worth crap in 15, 16, and 17 using the preceding year's top quarterback. So if you just drafted, oh, this was the best quarterback last year, I'll draft again. Well, it's going to cost you. Just blind allegiance is going to cost you. And in 18 was -9, 15, 19 was -5, not so bad. And so what I did was took an average, okay, a 6-year average, you could put 6-year average there, and notice the top three were really extreme. So every year we have a list of the top three quarterbacks, but the next year, on average, we are losing about 8 to 11 spots. So with nothing else to go on, it would not be to your advantage to draft your first quarterback from the top three last year. That's what the data is suggestive. Okay? And isn't that interesting? But if you wait to the fourth to, say, the 10th or 11th even, or maybe even to the 13th, you're actually not losing a lot, and potentially here this on average has gained 8 slots, gained 4 slots. So your late quarterback is actually more beneficial here, picking in this region, kind of a sweet spot here, 8th through 11th. So with nothing else to do, avoiding the top three last year and looking at the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, maybe you could even say at the 5th or 4th down. But picking your first quarterback in that range is going to, on average, over the years, you'll do better than picking the top three. That's what the data is really telling us. That's a great direction. So you don't, as far as I know, because I hadn't heard every pod. It's the first time anybody's ever mentioned that and used data. Nope, you won't hear it. In fact, they'll be squawking about, they'll overly focus on the top 2 or 3, and you will be potentially on average misled and take it'll be a higher uncertainty pick. And uncertainty is not our friend. Okay. And notice the variation then is very high in the top even 4. Notice it's very low from about 5th to about the 11th. So that's suggestive we do better picking in that range. The variation supports that as well, picking in those ranges. So you could wait probably 9th, 10th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and do just as good as the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So why, and we're talking draft rounds, that's a big difference in draft rounds. So you've hoarded running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends while everybody's taking the more risky picks, and that's fine, more uncertain picks, I should say. So if you want actionable items, this chart is worth its weight in gold, in my opinion. And that's how I will be proceeding accordingly based on the actual reality data, not wishes and dreams of the podcasters chop flapping. Not pulling any punches. My bad. Those that people I like do podcast. Hey, it is what it is. Sorry. This is my process, and I'm not here going on your show and crabbing on you, but it's my show, and I'm gonna tell you like it is. I would be doing my students a disservice if I wasn't frank about what the data is suggested on average, and always keep that in the back of your mind. So we look across kind of a smoothing out the data, which I do like. Data smoothing is always fun. I mean, you cut off some of the metrics, and we can argue should we smooth data or not, but this is the blue is the average differences, and notice the sweet spot here, right in here. Okay, notice that at the 0 that these are producing above the 0. That means they're returning probably some nicer value, whereas your top 3 is not on average returning any kind of value. You're losing draft capital. And notice we have some not so good. And for your second quarterback in 2 quarterbacks leagues, I'm talking in this range, you're getting some value here versus this range. So some people grab here and here, and in 2 quarterback leagues, I might wait here and there. With everything being on average and having nothing else to guide us. Do note that the variation is higher though. So it's much more uncertainty in this area. And the higher uncertainty, kind of a barbell of uncertainty here in this red data, the variation. Notice the lowest variation happens to go with the sweeter spot right at there. So that's where I'm looking this year. So looking at these names from last year and looking for changes. Who's getting a better situation, a better strength of schedule, better coaches, free agent wide receivers, etc. Who's going to benefit from changes, right? Change is your friend. Okay, this is really a neat chart as well. Really brings this business home, in my opinion. So I'm interested in something called scaled metrics. These are scaled usually to the average, and that gives you a little finer view of what the data is really telling you here from 02 to 20. And we have the average fantasy points, the standard deviation, or pretty much a measure of the variation. And we've seen more points recently, but more variation. So again, there's nothing here with the early quarterback drafting that's supported by that. So it is like it's been. The gaps have pretty much stayed the same. And if you look at the scaled numbers and the variation, it is clear that there's 2 halves to the 18 years. The front, the back half, and then this is the era we live in now. And again, there's nothing to suggest that late or early quarterback is a way to go from this data. But in the previous data, I think the top 3 and the sweet spot, you can hang your hat on that. This is, looking at all 12. Okay, all 12. Or even, this may be all quarterbacks here. I forgot. My bad. Here's the saying showing the complete difference in the production in the green. Production of fantasy points has gone up. Notice the variation. has right on top of it now. So it's the highest, some of the highest variation that's ever seen in 18 years is right here. So we're dealing with the highest variations as well as the highest average numbers here. So we had some low variation, higher numbers. That's not better for earlier quarterback and pick than this data in this world here. So, do track this. And we see the exact opposite. Here we say the much higher versus low variation. So this would definitely help you for picking, later quarterbacks. This would be late QB. And having a high variation and a low average would support earlier quarterbacks, but we don't see that at all. We can look at these rankings by failures and successes. Last year's ranks versus this year's ranks, the same kind of table I showed you. I'm going to show it to you again, but now I'm going to call failures and successes in each group. Just to use that as a look-see. Same data, top 1, 2, and 3, we're going to have issues, and notice we have 4, 2, and 3 failures. Here's, don't know where that might be my bad. That could be more of a 3 here. Depends on what the 9 is. I consider that a failure, but I was trying just to look at these extreme failures here. So there's 3, there's 2, there's none, there's 2 here, there's 1 there, there's 3 there. Notice right here in the sweeter spot, very few failures in this block. In fact, a lot of success. So again, the supporting of a sweeter spot and late quarterback is suggested by looking simply at failures versus successes using last year's rankings going into this year's. So notice the story is not one. Some people, you can't, throw out last year's rankings. Well, no. Some people say rely on last year's rankings. No. So as usual, the story is more complex than the simplification. It's easy to talk simple. It's harder to have different ideas and conflicting data. That's why fantasy football is tough, because it's not so smooth and easy to figure out to do that. Okay, so successes versus failures here. And I plotted that. The green are the successes. Here's the sweeter areas in here. Nice success. Here's the failure areas in here. In the top, actually 4 maybe. But you do get a little bit of a success. So for sure the top 3. And notice we're kind of equal, maybe a little bit more skewed to the favorites. But this is deep in the quarterback rankings here. Okay. By the way, you rarely see last year's, 23rd being first. Okay. There is kind of some limits there. The extremes don't occur as much as people wish they would occur, right? But anyway, you could still get some good gains from if you waited super late, especially on your second quarterback in a 2-quarterback league. There is some advantages there. And so we will pick up in part 2 the averages versus the age sector. So we're coming back to digging into the age sectors a little bit, talk a little bit about that, and then the experience sectors, and we've got some more in part 2. Please come back. I'll be lesson 21. So we're having lots of fun. This is Dr. Bush for the process, trying to help you in the process to crush your draft, and that gives you such an advantage going in to the season because you're going to be ahead of most of your league at that point. And you know, their mistakes are going to unwind them by the time the playoffs hit. You should be in pretty good shape on average at that point. Okay, come back. We're having lots of extra fun.